Today, my guest is the Honorable Preston Manning. We'll be talking about the state of Canada. And does that state of Canada include Alberta, let alone Saskatchewan and other parts of the West? What is the pathway forward from a policy point of view? Well, it's the aftermath of a federal election, and there's been a lot happened since then. And Canadians have selected a minority Liberal government. And so we're going to face, yet again, as a nation, a number of key policy decisions. We're going to talk not only about the economy, but national unity, and what is the prescription going forward as we talk about not only domestic issues, but our foreign relationship with the United States. So with me here today to discuss those important policy issues is, of course, our friend, the Honorable Preston Manning. Welcome, Preston.
Well, thank you, David.
Well, it's great to see you, and we certainly have a lot to cover, and I really value your analysis and insight coming out of the election, and certainly as we look to the pathway forward for our country. And so I'm very grateful for that. I want to reflect first on, well, the federal election, because I know that you've certainly watched this very carefully, but we had our, quote, January 6th in terms of the resignation of our Prime Minister, then Justin Trudeau. And the Parliament was prorogued. We had, of course, a leadership selection with the Liberal Party, and of course a switch to the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister Mark Carney. And it's really a remarkable set of number of weeks. But if you could share with us and help us understand from your perspective what really happened during this election period.
Well, I think two things that completely changed the ground on which a lot of the preparation for the election had been done, particularly by the federal Conservatives. The first is getting rid of Justin Trudeau and replacing him with somebody else, which was a major shift. But probably the even bigger factor was President Trump interfering in Canadian political affairs by making
Indeed.
comments about everything from the 52nd state to everything else, and enabling the Liberals to wrap themselves in the flag to use again the politics of fear, as were done in the COVID crisis, as was done with respect to global warming, and now it was fear of Trump and the fear of him taking over the country, and this was used to move a lot of voters. So I think those two factors, which weren't even in the picture 3 months before, had a major impact on the election.
So I think your observations seem to suggest there was a fear factor, a psychology, if you will, of our nation as we looked at, well, the possibility or a challenge from the United States as we read Donald Trump's tweets.
Well, I think, of course, there's consultants these days, political consultants, and the Liberals certainly have them, that say the cheapest, quickest way to get support for a public policy or position is to strike fear into the hearts of the people. That's the way you get them to obey health measures during a pandemic. That's the way that a major attempt was made to get support for global warming initiatives, and that was the main tactic used in the election by Mr. Carney. His last statement to the leaders' debate, when they gave them a minute to talk at the end, his was that Mr. Trump wants to take over your country, which is nonsense and not feasible, but it strikes fear into the hearts of people. The pollsters say particularly older people, and that stampeded a lot of people into the Liberal camp. I think the other worry about the election, and I was concerned about this before, is I think it's creating a national unity problem. If you look at the map and you color who got the seats in the east and who got them in the west, it just almost looks like two different countries. One is completely red and the other is completely blue. And so I think one of the major consequences of the election is an increased strain on the bonds of unity, both in Quebec and now in Western Canada as well.
Indeed. So when you look at the election, I think the other element that was very interesting was almost the collapse of the NDP. Why did you think that happened? What's your analysis?
Well, I couldn't understand why this didn't dawn on Mr. Singh a little earlier that if you keep supporting the Liberals, the voters in your own NDP ridings are going to say, well, why should we vote for you? You're just going to vote the Liberals. We might as well vote Liberal. And he virtually torpedoed his own party, and those votes mainly stampeded into the Liberal camp.
Yeah, and at the same time, it seems like there was a significant draw of conservative support. I think it's a near record number of votes for the Conservative Party, towards 42% nationally. And there was a gain of I believe it's 26 seats in the House. So there's certainly a measure of results there. Was your sense that there were a number of more working class people that were voting for the Conservatives rather than the NDP?
Well, I think that some of the pollsters say that if the campaign had gone on for another month, gradually the concerns were shifting from being scared stiff of Trump onto the more practical things, the cost of living and what high deficits and high debts and high taxes do to keep that up. And there probably would have been a convergence of Liberal and Conservative support as far as the polls were concerned. I think another thing that the polls point out is that the highest degree of support for the Conservatives was among 18 to 30-year-olds. In other words, the younger generation who was more preoccupied with those types of things because it affects their immediate standard of living in their future, that they were increasingly coming to the Conservatives, and they did not swallow the Liberal line that Trump was going to take over the country. So it was a complex and different election, and what we end up with is a minority Liberal government that promised a lot of things that were actually in the Conservative platform. But the question there is whether people believe those those promises will be followed up on. And this division of the country almost between East and West that I think harbors difficulties with respect to national unity.
Well, it certainly is a challenging aftermath of this election. We certainly wish the Carney government all the best as it tries to bring our country forward. And would it be fair to say that if you were advising the Prime Minister, what would be the top priorities? Would it be the economy after?
Well, the first thing I'd say to him is more political. I think the government, and I think Canadians, have to understand populism, particularly if you want to deal with someone like Trump, who's on top of a populist movement in the United States. This is bottom-up political energy. They got tired of the aristocratic elites telling them what to do. And I think the first thing in negotiating with the United States is to understand populism. And I always stick in when I get talking about that. There's one region of North America that has had more experience with populism, not just populist movements that became governments, which is fairly rare. It's Western Canada. So my first advice to the government, and it won't be heeded because Ottawa does not understand populism, which is part of why it doesn't understand Western Canada very well, that this would be one of the major things to understand. What it means with respect to Trump, you can counter tariffs with counter tariffs. This is simplistic economics and politics, and the net result is no one wins tariff wars. you end up increasing the price to consumers, the price of goods subject to the tariffs and the counter tariffs. If you understand the populism that put Trump where he is, there's a second route to dealing with him, and that is to get to him through his own followers. A populist leader's on the top of this heap of political energy that put him there. He promised certain things to these people. 77 million Americans voted for him. You can't dismiss that. But what did he promise them? One of the things he promised them was to lower their cost of living. Now, some of them are already starting to figure out that what tariffs do is increase their cost of living. So one of the ways to get to him, if you want to reduce the tariff tension, is to get to him through his own followers. And what that means is the Americans are going to have congressional elections in 2026. Some of the campaigns are already underway. You've got Republican senators that want to get elected in some of these states where Mr. Trump said he was going to reduce our cost of living, but it's going up. Those senators and those followers are going to put anti-tariff pressure on Trump. I would say even greater than anything any foreign country can do by going to Washington and having a half-hour session in the Oval Room. So I guess my general proposition here is that we do a lot better in dealing with Trump if we understood populism, and there's lessons to be learned from our own experience in that connection.
Indeed. Well, and what I find interesting about, well, you challenging us to understand the nature of populism that's happening in the United States is to also understand, as you say, the nature of that in Canada, because this is going back, well, strategically many generations, as you've written about. I mean, you're a columnist and author.
Populism is to Western Canadian political culture what soft nationalism is to Quebec. I mean, what was Riel, his first rebellion, was bottom-up people protesting about somebody coming and doing something to them from on high. And then the Farmers' Party, all of those Farmers' Parties, those were populist movements, populist governments. United Farmers of Alberta, United Farmers of Manitoba, United Farmers of Ontario were not just populist movements, they formed governments. And then the Depression created two new political parties out of the frustration, the CCF in Saskatchewan, Social Credit in Alberta. Both of them were populist movements, and both of them ended up running governments. And one of the things that you can learn from Western populism that would be applicable to Trump is if the leader of a populist movement gets too far off the agenda that got him or her elected, those people will pull them back to the agenda and the promises he made to get there. And if he doesn't do that, they can desert him and pull him down. And one of the illustrations was when the CCF began in Saskatchewan as a social democratic party, so-called left of center. There were some people among their elites, particularly academics, who were classic socialists, Marxist socialists, who said that the first plank in the platform of a socialist party should be the nationalization of land. That was the key plank in the platform of all the socialist parties in Europe.
The nationalization of land.
Yeah. But can you imagine in Saskatchewan if the CCF had started to go down that road? The common sense farmers in Saskatchewan said, "Wait a minute, we voted for you to have social welfare and eventually get Medicare, but if you get off onto that, you will not be the government of Saskatchewan for 6 months." This is a case of your own bottom-up rank and file. Correcting the straying of the leadership. And I think eventually Trump's going to get some messages like that. You promised to get our cost of living down. These tariffs are making it up. Get off the tariff bandwagon.
Oh. So there's a lot riding on the economy in the United States as it relates to the populist movement that has given birth to a Donald Trump. At the same time, there's a lot riding on the economy. I mean, Canada's experienced basically a stagnant economy. We've got this graph here that can illustrate the economic performance where Canada is basically at less than 1% over 10 years, whereas the United States
Yeah,
is going
yeah.
ahead at 21%. So the economy then is foundational, then, is it not, to the national unity challenges that we face, Preston?
Well, yes, I think the worse the performance of the economy, the more attention you get on the bounds of national unity. But David, I ask if I would ask public audiences, what's the greatest economic strength of Canada? On what ground are we
Indeed.
internationally competitive, even bigger than the United States? Well, not population, not financial resources. We don't have the smartest government. We've proved that. But what we do have, we happen to be the second largest country by land mass in the world, which
Indeed.
means we have either the largest or the second largest stock of natural resources. That the foundational building blocks of the Canadian economy are agriculture, energy, mining, forestry, and the fishery. And that doesn't mean, when you say agriculture, that doesn't mean just cows in the field and waving fields of grain. On top of that production sector is an agricultural manufacturing sector. On top of that is an agricultural service sector. On top of that is an agricultural knowledge sector. And that's the same for all the other natural resource sectors. But at the foundation is the natural resources. And how did the Trudeau government treat the natural resource sector? They treated them like they were relics from the past, or even worse, environmental liabilities. In other words, our greatest potential economic strength was shoved into the background, which is utter stupidity in my view. And if you're going to have an economic recovery, if you're going to have an economic revival, I think it's going to have to start by recognizing those natural resource sectors as fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy. And there's no stronger advocates of that right now in the country than Premier Smith in Alberta and Premier Moe in Saskatchewan.
Indeed. So this is the context of today, where we have a challenged economy, a stagnant economy. And therefore, you're asking the fundamental question, are we going to continue with the course of policies from the last 10 years going forward? Is that the question that we face?
Yes, and one of the litmus tests as to whether the Carney government's got any of the messages on the need for restoration of the natural resource economy is whether the federal government will reduce its intrusiveness in the natural resource sector. The Constitution assigns the natural resources to the provinces, but the federal government has intruded in that area in a way to almost cripple the sector. The Bill C-69 that makes it virtually impossible to build pipelines in the country, emissions caps, regulation on top of regulation that, I just almost despair on when Prime Minister Chrétien came back from signing that. I asked him, does Canada get credit for reducing the carbon emissions in another country? And under that accord, he said no. Well, I said that was a huge mistake, because I think the biggest way we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions is to export LNG to China and replace those coal-fired plants with LNG. What was this, 25 years ago? Since that time, the United States, which was about at the same status as Canada with respect to LNG, they have built 27 LNG export facilities with the pipelines to support them and everything else. Canada has not built one.
No, it's remarkable.
Why is that?
Despite having nation after nation, whether it's Greece, whether it's the UK, whether it's, well, there's a whole list of them
Oh,
coming
yes, and
forward
despite
wanting this.
having the capability, we have people that can build pipelines and LNG, understood LNG just as good as the Americans, but crippled by government regulation, government delays by the federal government. So coming back to one thing that would send a signal that the federal government is going to take the natural resource sector seriously would be whether this throne speech includes legislation to amend the statutes which authorize federal intrusion in natural resources. That would be
Indeed.
one clear signal that they're hearing something from the West. And ironically, that would not only be supported in the West, that is one thing that would be heavily supported in Quebec, where the federal Liberals have a fair number of seats. So I guess my long rambling discourse is that the strength of this country is its natural resources that's been crippled by federal government intervention and mismanagement over the last 10 years. The sign that we're getting back on track would reduce the intrusiveness of the federal government in those sectors so that the private sector can get on doing what it's perfectly capable of doing.
Right on. So I think that's a brilliant summary. We have the opportunity as a nation. We've got everything going for us to be the most prosperous, free trading country in the world. And yet we've mismanaged those natural opportunities. And so I think you're calling for us for a significant policy signal from the new Carney administration to just do that.
Yeah, that would be a start. And there's a lot of skepticism out there. People do not put faith in statements made by political people during elections. They want to see the proof of that commitment to the restoration of the resource sectors. And maybe the throne speech would be one of the first places they can see whether that proof is there or not.
But the answer to your question, though, really provides the answer to the national unity question. If a province like Alberta, a province such as Saskatchewan, let alone others related to, say BC and Manitoba, can't pursue vigorous prosperity within their own provincial jurisdiction, then why would you subscribe to the 1867 vision of the founding of this country? There's no reason to stay, would there?
Well, this puts enormous strains on the bounds of unity. And one of the things that there's a small group and myself who are watching the polling to see that there's a fair amount of Western, even support for secession. And it's not confined to Alberta. This is another thing. The Central Canadian media insists this is an Alberta thing. No. Polls show it's much broader than Alberta. In fact, this unrest is just as strong in Saskatchewan. It extends into many parts of particularly rural Manitoba. It extends into central, eastern, and northern British Columbia. This is a Western Canadian unrest. It's not just Alberta. And one of the things, a small group, we're watching to see if the election of the Carney government spikes this unrest, whether it makes it greater rather than less. Some of these polls will come out in the next couple of weeks. And secondly, what we're looking at is creating some kind of Canada West Assembly, a pan-Western assembly to get people together from those regions and to look at the 4 or 5 major options facing the West with respect to the future. And that can include just amending the status quo in accordance with what the premiers are saying. It could include amending the status quo in accordance with what the new government has to say, if they have anything to say on that at all. But it can go all the way to taking a hard look at secession and getting into the practicalities. Secession to do what? Secession to create an independent country. Secession to create an independent country with the intention of some new relationship joining the United States, secession in the sense of sovereignty association like Quebec has suggested. There's about 4 or 5 options if the West wants to do something about its current unrest. And the idea would be to have this assembly get these options out on the table, not have a situation where you can't talk about that. No, you can talk about whatever. But you're going to be subject to cross-examination by some people that know an awful lot about what you're talking about. And get these things out in the open and take a straw vote at the end. Which option would people think would be the best for Western Canada, and recommend that to the provincial governments. Now, whether this comes about is still very embryonic, partly depending on reading some of the polls that are coming out. But that would be one way to create a kind of a container for this unrest that doesn't squelch it, but doesn't let it go off in 49 directions or get hijacked by extremists or eccentric characters who are out there.
So what I'm hearing you say, Preston, is, and it's not a surprise, given certainly your character and analysis, is for thoughtful reflection on the key options that the West face, so that we can actually not avoid the discussion, but embrace the discussion and say, how do we move this, not only the West forward, but potentially Canada? I mean, depending on the option, but we
Yeah,
can't.
and David, and have it's pathetic that I have to add this adjective, a democratic discussion. Like, where in
Good
this
point.
country now have we got a forum where there is democratic debate? It's not in the legislatures, which are so divided on a partisan basis. It's certainly not in the Parliament of Canada. Here, the Parliament of Canada hasn't met for months during a period when huge issues have been dealt with. Can we not get back to creating some kind of forum, and the rules that have to be laid out right in the beginning, where you're going to have an opportunity to present your position? You're not going to be shouted down. You're not going to be shut off. You're not going to be squelched. But then once your position is out there, it's going to be subject to this discussion and cross-examination. People who have a different view are going to have a chance to say, well, I don't think that's as good as my view. Experts can say, well, did you think about the constitutional aspect? Are you aware of the economic or trade implications of what you're saying? But so that'll be a cross-examination. And then you, as the proponent of some position, you have to sit and listen to other people's positions. You can't walk out of the room because the only one is your position. No, no, no. They sat here and listened to you. You're going to sit here and listen to them. And then after that, we're going to take a vote and ask the majority of people in this room, you've heard this option, and this option, and you've heard it back and forth. Which one, if you had to recommend it to the government of Alberta, the government of Saskatchewan, the government of Canada, which one would you do? Like, where can that type of discussion occur today? And the idea would be to try to create a assembly where maybe for a week it could happen there, and partly to demonstrate to Canadians there is a democratic way to sort through these options if we would let those principles of democratic discourse prevail.
All right. So that's an interesting challenge. So you're suggesting that this could be part of a process. Is that what you're referring to when Daniel Smith talks about a so-called panel regarding
Well, no,
sovereignty
if
options?
if she goes ahead with that, and I think she will, and it's a good idea, and Premier Smith may do something different, I would see that the conclusions of that panel being put into this assembly. They might not be as far along into their final conclusions, but I would think a group like that that's been constituted by the government could make input to this assembly. Say, look, from what we've heard, this is the route we should go. And basically they're following up on Premier Smith's approach, which is to say, look, the status quo is not good enough. But if the status quo was modified in this way, if you got rid of Bill C-69, if you got out of the natural resources area, if you did away with the tanker ban, whatever the list of items is, then the West would be more content in the Federation. And this assembly would be a good place to reiterate those types of demands.
Okay. So that kind of vigorous policy discussion about the options by which provinces, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, can pursue their sovereignty, the development of their provinces, will really address the question of how those parts of the country can relate to Canada. I think it was you years ago, Preston, coined the phrase, the West wants in. Is the question now how the West wants out?
Well, there will be groups that will advocate that, and say they wouldn't be prohibited from bringing that option to the table, but it'll be subject to a little more cross-examination than a lot of them have got so far. And that would be one of the options. And they'll be asked, out to do what? Some of them will say, out to join the United States. So then some lawyer will ask them, have you ever read the Constitution of the United States? Have you read the sections that provide for a territory to become a state? Do you know that that can't be unilaterally done by the president, no matter what he says in press conferences, that would require congressional approval? You think the
Indeed.
Congress of the United States right now would welcome a thing the size of in Canada? Would they welcome the Quebec problem in addition to all the problems that they got? Do you realize that the fourth Article 4 of the American Constitution says that if a territory is going to join the United States, you have to prove that the people in that territory, a majority of them, want to do that, and that they have to have a constitutional convention to adopt a republican form of government? Dude, have you thought all that through? So maybe they have, but maybe they haven't, and this forum would be a good place to get that sort of thing out.
So we are daring to, well, peel the perennial onion here, and things aren't quite as simple as we might think they are.
No.
But nevertheless, these are very real forces and concerns in Western Canada. It's interesting. I just got back from Ottawa, and it's fascinating in conversation with people. It almost seems like there's a kind of a bubble chamber, or a kind of a sense that, well, these are just Western grievances again, and they'll go away. Do you think it's that simple, Preston?
No, there's an indifference to the public in central Canada to all these issues. It's partly as a result of the central Canadian media. They are indifferent to these concerns. They never report them, and if they do report them, they get it wrong half the time. In fact, there's a joke going around that if you wanted to fan the flames of Western separatism, the best way to do it would be to give a subscription to the Toronto Star to every family in Western Canada. That would probably...
I think you're right.
Because it would illustrate the indifference, and then indifference leads to ignorance on the issues, and that leads to positions that are out of tune with reality.
Indeed. Well, we certainly have heard a lot from Premier Daniel Smith, and I want to talk a little bit with your kind help. We have a clip here that is one of her recent statements on a number of very important announcements regarding a referendum and also key conditions.
We continue to do all in our power to counteract Ottawa's chill on investment in energy, agriculture, and our other job sectors through various tax cuts and incentive programs, which greatly strain the provincial budget. We have fought these attacks from Ottawa furiously and have won some important battles, but the lost opportunities, jobs, and futures of so many Albertans are costly and demoralizing, as are the growing number of Eastern politicians who choose to openly demonize and target Alberta for political gain. That is why a large majority of Albertans are so deeply frustrated with the results of last week's federal election. It's not that our preferred candidate and party lost. That happens in a democracy. It's that the same Liberal government with almost all the same ministers responsible for our nation's inflation, housing, crime, and budget crisis, and that oversaw the attack on our provincial economy for the past 10 years, have been returned to power. Now, as we all know, one thing has changed. We have a new Prime Minister. And I will say that in my first conversation with him since the election, he had some promising things to say about changing the direction of his government's anti-resource policies. However, Albertans are more of a actions speak louder than words kind of people. So while I will in good faith work with Prime Minister Mark Carney on unwinding the mountain of destructive legislation and policies that have ravaged our provincial and national economies this past decade, until I see tangible proof of real change, Alberta will be taking steps to better protect ourselves from Ottawa. As a start, I will soon appoint a special negotiating team to represent our province in negotiations with the federal government on the following reforms requested by our province. We hope this will result in a binding agreement that Albertans can have confidence in. Call it an Alberta Accord, if you will. First, Alberta requires guaranteed corridor and port access to tidewater off the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic coasts for the international export of Alberta oil, gas, critical minerals, and other resources in amounts supported by the free market, rather than by the dictates and whims of Ottawa. Every province in the country, other than Alberta and Saskatchewan, have coastal port access, and no province needs it more given the size and value of our resources. This will benefit all Canadians to the tune of trillions of dollars of economic activity, including billions for First Nations partners. Second, the federal government must end all federal interference in the development of provincial resources by repealing the No New Pipelines Law, C-69, the oil tanker ban, the net zero electricity regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, the net zero vehicle mandate, and any federal law or regulation that purports to regulate industrial carbon emissions, plastics, or the commercial free speech of energy companies. These laws are destroying investment confidence and costing Canada and Alberta hundreds of billions in investments each year. They need to go. Third, the federal government must refrain from imposing export taxes or restrictions on the export of Alberta resources without the consent of the government of Alberta. Frankly, all provinces should be given that same respect for their resources. And fourth, the federal government must provide to Alberta the same per capita federal transfers and equalization as is received by the other three largest provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. We have no issue with Alberta continuing to subsidize smaller provinces with their needs, but there is no excuse for such large and powerful economies like Ontario, Quebec, BC, or Alberta to be subsidizing one another. That was never the intent of equalization, and it needs to end. If these points can be agreed to by the federal government, I am convinced it will not only make Alberta and Canada an infinitely stronger and more prosperous country, but will eliminate the doubts a growing number of Albertans feel about the future of Alberta in Canada. While these negotiations with Ottawa are ongoing, our government will appoint, and I will chair, the Alberta Next panel. This panel will be composed of some of our best and brightest judicial, academic, and economic minds to join with me in a series of in-person and online town halls to discuss Alberta's future in Canada, and specifically, what next steps we can take as a province to better protect Alberta from any current or future hostile policies of the federal government. Details of the membership and scope of that panel will be released in the coming weeks. After the work of the panel is finished, it is likely we will place some of the more popular ideas discussed with the panel to a provincial referendum so that all Albertans can vote on them sometime in 2026. To be clear from the outset, our government will not be putting a vote on separation from Canada on the referendum ballot. However, if there is a successful citizen-led referendum petition that is able to gather the requisite number of signatures requesting such a question to be put on a referendum, our government will respect the democratic process and include that question on the 2026 provincial referendum ballot as well. I also want to state unequivocally that as Premier, I'm entirely committed to protecting, upholding, and honoring the inherent rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Therefore, any citizen-initiated referendum question must not violate the constitutional rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and must uphold and honor Treaties 6, 7, and 8, should any referendum question ever pass. This is non-negotiable. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, that being separation. We are well aware that there is a large and growing number of Albertans that have lost hope in Alberta having a free and prosperous future as a part of Canada. Many of these Albertans are organizing petitions to trigger a citizen-initiated referendum, as I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of these individuals are not fringe voices to be marginalized or vilified. They are loyal Albertans. They are quite literally our friends and neighbors who've just had enough of having their livelihoods and prosperity attacked by a hostile federal government. They're frustrated, and they have every reason to be. I want to talk directly to those Albertans. I know how frustrated so many of you have become with our country and the feeling of having politicians living thousands of miles away passing laws and rules that have cost you your loved ones, jobs, careers, dreams, and opportunities for a brighter future. As most Albertans know, I have repeatedly stated I do not support Alberta separating from Canada. I personally still have hope that there is a path forward for a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada.
Well, there's certainly a lot to unpack there, Preston, but I'm wondering if you have any immediate response to that statement. I mean, it sounds like Premier Smith is trying to enable a democratic voice, a possible referendum in next year, 2026, but is doing it in a way that tries to respect that there's a variety of voices here that need to be heard. Is that it?
Well, yes. To me, it seems axiomatic in a democracy. At the end of the day, if you're going to make a huge shift like this, you got to ask the people, and one way to do it is through citizens' initiatives or referenda. This has been part of the Western Canadian political culture for years, and I don't understand why Central Canada is so surprised or sees this sort of thing threatening. What's wrong with asking the rank and file people whose future is affected what direction they'd like to go, and making sure that
Indeed.
the various options are out on the table? It's been perfectly acceptable for Quebec to have referendums on secession and varieties of it, sovereignty association. Well, what's wrong with the West? The challenge for Danielle and for Alberta is that this is broader than Alberta, this unrest. So ideally, eventually, there has to be some kind of pan-Western approach to this issue.
Indeed.
Because there are other parts of and conceivably other parts of the West could do something similar. But I think we do need to eventually have a pan-Western approach, because that's much more serious from the standpoint of Central Canada. If you've got 4 provinces and 2 territories talking about this as distinct from one province.
Indeed.
And it's important, as she points out, for if there's different points of view on this, well, that can be handled and expressed and voted on in a referendum.
Correct. Now, speaking of other parts of Western Canada, Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, also had a recent statement as well.
So Canadians have spoken, and I would take this opportunity to congratulate Prime Minister Mark Carney on his election win. Canadians have provided him and your party and your government a new mandate. And while you had very strong support in some parts of Canada, there are many Canadians, including most of us in Saskatchewan, who voted for a degree of change. And now it's up to you to show that you have heard that message and to deliver change, not only for Saskatchewan people, but for many Canadians as well. For Saskatchewan industries that help drive the Canadian economy and very much are part of the Canadian economy, to provide some degree of change for Saskatchewan people. Last night, what I heard was that the Prime Minister Carney had said that he wants to work with both Saskatchewan and Alberta. He's also said that he wants to make Canada into a global leading energy superpower. And that's great to hear, but those are nothing but words. And I would say, and I've said it many times, that policies truly do matter, in particular in this space. And so some of the government's policies, the federal government's policies, they quite simply are going to need to change in order for Canada to achieve that goal. What Prime Minister Carney had said is that we must deal with the United States of America and the Trump administration from a position of strength, and I couldn't agree more with that statement. And making Canada the world-leading energy superpower would be a pretty good start to dealing with the United States as well as any other allied country from a position of strength. We have some ideas on how we can jointly achieve that as a provincial government, and what policies this new administration may need to alter to some degree in order for us as Canadians to achieve that global energy superpower. So I would say that this is an opportunity for each and all of us to hit the reset button, if you will, on the federal government's relationship with the province and the people of Saskatchewan, and I hope that this offer is taken. And I would take this opportunity to invite Prime Minister Carney to a meeting here in Saskatchewan, where we'd love to host him, to chart a productive path forward for our province within the nation of Canada. I want to work alongside this federal government to build a strong and growing Saskatchewan, as I said, within a very united and strong growing nation of Canada.
So here we have Premier Scott Moe basically saying, hey, we wish this new federal government all the best, but we want a reset because there's similar issues, not the same necessarily. I don't want to be presumptuous, but it's interesting as well that a recent survey in British Columbia identified some 28% of people from that province also wanting some form of separation. And again, one has to take this with a grain of salt because we're not clear what that means exactly. In Manitoba, I'm not clear what that percentage would be. But the point is that your challenge is that this is a larger phenomenon, and it begs the question: how do we hear each other and realize that these are significant concerns? They're not just policy concerns about getting energy to markets and stopping this endless war on oil and gas. It's also constitutional concerns, and I can't think of many better people to talk to about that perspective than yourself, Preston Manning. I mean, you've seen this unfold over years as you articulated the need for, well, for example, a equal, elected, accountable Canadian Senate. Instead, the Senate has been now appointed with a variety of people that don't seem to represent anything significant about Western Canada. Am I missing the point here?
Well, some of the remedies would require constitutional changes, but there we're up against a brick wall because the Canadian Constitution is virtually unamendable. It requires the consent of the federal government and the consent of usually 7 out of 10 of the provinces, and you can't get 7 of the 10 of the provinces to agree what day it is, let alone a constitutional amendment. Now, one drastic scenario is if Quebec decided to leave, it would blow the Constitution apart. Constitution would have to be completely redone. But is that what it takes to get constitutional change? So that drives you back to, although there are certain things, can they be done without amending the Constitution? What if there were free votes in the federal parliament? What if the next premier, I tried to get Chrétien to get up and say this, but I even offered to write it out for him. I told him it'd take you 20 seconds to say this. But get up, the government, federal government should get up, a new prime minister should get up and say, look, this government will not resign unless it loses an explicit motion of non-confidence in the government. We will not resign if we lose a vote on Section 24 of some bill. In fact, we won't even resign if we lose the vote on the bill. If that happens, we'll immediately ask the House, did you just mean to kill that bill, or did you actually mean to kill the government? Of course, then its own members will flock back and support the government. But if you had this one change in the confidence convention and then freer votes, some of these members, even Liberal members from other parts of the country, would be able to get up and say, look, on this, I know I'm part of the Liberal government, but where I come from, this doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to support it. Just changing the confidence convention and providing free votes in the House of Commons would allow a little bit better regional representation. The other thing that I think we need to consider here, David, is if you just protest federal intrusion in the natural resource area, which is provincial jurisdiction, that doesn't mean a lot to a whole bunch of other people that aren't aware of that and couldn't care less about it. But the federal government intrudes in other areas as well. It intrudes in the health field. Health is a provincial responsibility. The federal government intrudes in it through the Canada Health Act, which says unless you have a system exactly like the one they want, they will reduce your Canada Health transfers. And so, of course, there's no innovation in the health sector, which there would be if you just they got out and let the provinces deal with it. The federal government intervenes in municipal governance and municipal affairs. The Constitution assigns that explicitly to the provinces, and it intervenes through the Canada Housing Act and through the Canada Mortgage Bank, which goes and lends billions of dollars to municipal governments and goes around the province, doesn't even have to confer with them. The federal government intervened, but the Constitution assigns property and civil rights to the provinces. So when the federal government intervened through the Emergency Act during COVID, without even consulting the provinces on it, it was treading in provincial areas. So
Indeed.
if the federal government was to withdraw its intrusions in every area where it intervenes, health, natural resources, municipal governance, civil liberties. This now, there's people in every province, every provincial government. I bet you every provincial government would support that. The federal government, federal-provincial relations are in a complete mess, mainly because of that. And if that reduction of intrusiveness was to occur, you would have support not just in the resource sectors. You'd have support in many other sectors, which is necessary for a national government to get national support, not just support from one part of the country.
So you're basically saying then, Preston, that this is not just simply a quote Western matter. This is a matter regarding provincial rights, so that provinces could actually come together in unity and reset the relationship or the pattern of the endless federal intrusion into provincial jurisdiction, which really undermines the ability to govern well for Canadians.
Yeah, and it's not as if the federal government wouldn't have anything to do if it couldn't intrude in provincial areas. No one disputes that the federal government has responsibility for defense, for national defense. No one disputes that it has ultimate responsibility for monetary policy, that it has ultimate responsibility for foreign affairs. No one disputes that. So why doesn't the federal government go and do a good job in those areas where there's no question about its jurisdiction instead of getting into these areas?
Well, it sure would be timely if the federal government took seriously to, well, run its ports well, to get on with national defense well, because the Americans obviously see us through the lens of security first, the economy second. And if you are not a full partner in NATO, which we really are not in Canada, it's well known that we've been a freeloader for years, then we won't be at the economic table. I think that's one of the messages that's been loud and clear here. So, yeah, I think we need to stay in our constitutional lanes and do what we do well.
Yeah, and actually this development of natural resources plays into the security question too. North America needs to be secure in terms of energy. It ought not to be importing energy from any place, but it does, and the United States does. And there's a need for Western Canadian Petroleum and Quebec electricity in order to get continental energy security. So we've got a contribution to make there to security through our resource development. I know you like stories, David, so here's a story going way back. The first time I ever heard the phrase continental energy security was from J. Howard Pugh, the head of the Sun Oil Company that built the first oil sands plant in Fort McMurray in the early 1960s. Pugh must have been 80 years of age at that time. He was one of the richest men in the United States. You might ask, what is this old guy doing up in Fort McMurray trying to get oil out of oil sands? Well, the story was the Pugh family made its money through the Pugh Shipbuilding Company in Philadelphia, and they happened to build a lot of the tankers that for the First World War and the Second World War. And Pugh was an authority on how many of them got sunk, and he became conscious that North America was vulnerable in terms of petroleum because it couldn't produce enough to supply its own needs, let alone supply the war machine. And so he said, let the Texas boys go and find conventional oil. I'm going to go to the unconventional sources and going to try and help bring them on stream. But continental energy security, that's what prompted the first oil sands plant in Alberta. So we got a card to play in this discussion of continental energy security, and it's an energy card as well as beefing up our military resources.
Isn't that interesting? Well, it's very timely because we know that because Canada really only has one primary customer, namely the United States for oil and gas, we're not a price maker, we're a price taker. And as a result, we sell our product at a significant discount. It does vary. It's a dynamic number. In fact, at Frontier, we released this counter that kind of shows literally minute by minute the kind of money that we're forfeiting because we don't get that world price. And in Alberta alone, it's like a $30 billion figure that we forfeit. And so I look at this and I say, if the economy is a top priority, which I think it is for 90% of Canadians, surely this would be an easy win, is if we made it a national emergency to make those utility corridors to bring product to Tidewater, whether it's on the West Coast or Hudson's Bay. Surely that's the kind of signal that we'd be looking for in policy to really move this country forward, including the West, everybody.
Well, to move petroleum, you got to have pipelines. And you better facilitate the ability to build pipelines. We have a condo on the banks of the Bow River in Calgary, and across the river is the old original Sir John A. Macdonald CPR line. Oh. And every now and then we see, I call them Trudeau trains. We see these 180, 200 car trains of oil tankers. Mm-hmm. That's not the cheapest and safest way to move petroleum, but we do it because we can't build pipelines. So certainly something that facilitated pipeline construction would be beneficial to the country.
So in this context, and we've had a far-reaching conversation today, Preston, and I really appreciate your insights here. How do you really see this? And I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but is this a historic time? Because I look at the state of our economy, and I do monitor money flows. The amount of hundreds of billions of dollars that have left this country the last 10 years is not a good omen for our future, let alone for the next generation. Are you concerned that we get on with it? We get on with building this country so we have hope and a prosperous future. And I don't understand. Do you see this as a historic moment?
Yeah, there's a danger in dwelling on all the difficulties, and I think it's better to get, what can be done to get out of this? And maybe just to summarize a little bit what we've talked about. One is to build on the natural resource sectors and remove the obstacles to doing that. Recognize that the regional character of the country, that this is a country of regions, Atlantic, Laurentian, the prairies, the Pacific region, the North, that each of those regions has distinctive, to use the Quebec word, distinctive aspirations and concerns that have to be dealt with. And if they aren't, you're going to pull the country in different directions. And thirdly, in dealing with our friend to the south, remember he's on top of a populist movement. So understand populism, and one of the first places to understand it is to understand the history of Western Canada.
Well said. Well, thank you very much, our friend Preston Manning. Thank you for joining this far-reaching conversation about the state of Canada as well as the future of our country.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.